Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today we're going to focus on a new book that was published by Dr. Krasno, and it focuses on the policy and practices at the United Nations. My guest is an expert on the UN. Dr. Krasno is on the faculty of the Department of Political Science at the City College of New York and is a lecturer at Columbia University. She teaches courses on the UN, peacekeeping, international law, and international organizations. Her most recent book is titled United Nations Policy and Practice. Dr. Krasno, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me, Bill, because you and I go way back.
Yes, we do. That's right. Yeah. We started this when we were 12 years old. So
of course,
that's what I tell everybody. But anyway, congratulations on your recent book. Why did you write this book, The UN Policy and Practice? Okay, great.
Yeah,
show and tell.
Just show and tell, exactly.
Yeah, show and tell, right.
Well, several years ago, I had done a book on the UN, which was an overview of the UN, published also with Lynn Reiner Publishers. But now in 2023, I found that it was out of date. You know, so much had happened and changed. And so I felt it was really important to redo the book, issue a new book. And so I've written a lot of the chapters, but in areas that I'm not an absolute expert, like funding the UN, financing the UN, development or disarmament, or health, then I invited other experts on that to join me in the book, and then we worked together.
And what are a couple of the main themes? I know you have different chapters on different aspects of the UN, but what were one or two of the main themes? You're talking about some of the major changes that took place that you wanted to incorporate in this new version, or the new edition.
Right. So we do cover the founding of the UN and an overview of the UN, various UN departments, but the departments have changed really significantly. And what I tell people is everyone is always asking, when is the UN going to reform? And I tell them it's always reforming because it has to adapt to the situations that are on the ground and that it faces, the challenges it faces. So instead of having the Department of Political Affairs, it now has the Department of Political and Peace Building Affairs, adding peace building because so much of the activity of the UN now is been involved in building peace. So not just coming in, doing a peace operation, holding an election and leaving, but building societies even before there might be a threat of conflict. Helping to build institutions and the capacity of governments in terms of, development of resources, disbursement of resources equally amongst members of the society, and judicial reform and military reform and so forth. So those were the kinds of things I needed to cover because things were changing.
I'm glad you mentioned peace building. That has been, as I see it, as an outsider looking in through the glass, as an area that has really developed and has been relatively successful. Because one of the main shortcomings of previous missions was that you would go in, stabilize the situation, separate the warring parties, get them to tacitly agree to something. Maybe they would, maybe they wouldn't, and then leave. And then the thing starts all over again or collapses, but you've got to work with countries. But is that a correct statement? And if it is, why do we not hear more about it? It seems like that maybe it's not exciting, it's not glamorous, it's not sexy for the media, but we need to hear more about some of these successes, do we not?
Yes, absolutely. And the frustrating thing about the media is that it likes to cover war and conflict and when things go wrong. When things are going well, the media is not interested because it doesn't sell papers or time, on the media. So the UN tries to reach out and inform the media and the public, but the public isn't always, or the editors are not always interested in something peaceful. But yeah, the Peace Building Commission was established several years ago, and it started out just focusing on Sierra Leone, Liberia, and rebuilding those countries after their civil wars. But it was so successful that now they're in about 25 different countries. And it is run and supported by member states, which is very important because countries are always worried about the UN budget, but it isn't added to the budget. It is through voluntary contributions by member states. So that also adds something new, that the UN is reaching out to partners to help work with the UN on developing peace.
Exactly. Now, you've taught classes on the United Nations, international organizations. You've met a variety of students, professors, private sector people, just on across the board. What are some of the major myths that you've heard about the United Nations? I've got a whole list myself. We could cross-check them someday, but what are some of the myths that are out there? Because there are so many. It's just mind-boggling, especially if you listen to certain so-called news channels, which they have some news and not much other news, like Fox or One America News or Newsmax, different ones like that. But what are some of the myths that you hear? They're so prevalent.
Yeah, well, all the time, we hear that the UN is dysfunctional, that it doesn't accomplish anything, because the news likes to cover the UN Security Council. And right now, that's true. The Security Council, because of the war in Ukraine and other issues, it's unfortunately subject to the veto, which really is a stumbling block in the UN. So you hear that all the time, but nobody talks about the amazing work that the High Commissioner for Refugees is doing, or the High Commissioner for Human Rights. The World Food Program, which delivers food around the world to people in crisis. Food and agriculture, which goes in countries and helps them develop better agricultural practices. Or the Sustainable Development Goals, which are 17 goals that cover an array of things that the UN is working very carefully with member states to help build sustainable economies around the world, and member states are partnering with that tremendously, as well as NGOs. NGOs work now very closely with the UN in terms of these kinds of partnerships to make things happen on the ground as partners. So we don't hear that, unfortunately.
It's true. And you also, one group that's been very actively involved with the United Nations has been the private sector over the past 15, 20 years or something like that, they've worked on a variety of things. You've seen Bill and Melinda Gates at the UN quite often, the CEOs of various corporations. I won't even get into naming, there are so many of them, but they go to the UN for these conferences, and they're involved in trying to deal with these problems like climate change, but it gets very little, if any, to no publicity, come right down to it, except for the core of media people who cover the UN. That's about the group that puts this information out. But you're absolutely right. You're talking about the High Commission for Refugees, Human Rights Council, different groups like that. And all of these are operating, to prove your point, are operating right now on the ground to keep Ukrainians alive and to help them. The World Food Program, the UN Children's Fund. On the other side of the UN, the Security Council has been dysfunctional. It's totally dysfunctional because of the veto situation that Russia can apply, which is the way it's set up. And of course, they're not going to change it. So it's a very difficult situation, very tricky, and it's a very delicate situation. And you got part of the UN really working on the ground to get the job done. The other part stifling what is happening. So it's a challenge. Well, what do you see as some of the shortcomings of the United Nations? What would you recommend, as you've looked at the UN as an expert over the years? What could be done to improve the United Nations, make it more effective, make it more efficient?
Well, let me just get back to the comment that you made about the Security Council, being dysfunctional, because there's been a lot of talk at the UN in the last few months on Security Council reform.
Right.
And the problem with that is that to reform the Security Council, you have to amend the charter. And to amend the charter, you have to have the agreement of the 5 permanent members. And so they're never going to vote themselves off the council. So you can expand the council, but you're not going to be able to get the P5 off, and you're not going to be able to remove the veto for the P5. So you just have to work your way around it. And so there is a mechanism called Uniting for Peace, which has been used several times in the last year or so. Totally, it's been used almost 20 times since it was first written in 1950. But this is a way that the General Assembly can actually take up an issue from the Security Council if the Security Council is unable to act. And on Ukraine, the issue has been moved to the General Assembly several times, 3 or 4 times in the last year or so, and which the General Assembly, with overwhelming majority, have voted to condemn Russia's aggression in Ukraine, to condemn the annexation of the eastern part of Ukraine into Russia. And so while it doesn't impose sanctions, or it doesn't initiate a peacekeeping operation or anything, what it does is leave a legal framework for the future on the Ukrainian issue, and also to give a sense to the international community that most countries in the UN are alarmed and oppose the threat and use of force by Russia in Ukraine. So there is a way to get around it. And I'm excited that the GA is very active about doing that.
That's very true. And the Security Council, I'd say it's dysfunctional in certain areas. It's not totally dysfunctional at all. But
right.
There were a couple of positive resolutions that came out to try to promote peace in Ukraine. And of course, the Russians were going to veto anything that had any teeth to it to get the Russians out of Ukraine. But the UN General Assembly has taken on a new role. It's gotten actually more aggressive, especially since tossing Russia off the Human Rights Council, which was just an embarrassing blow to Putin and to Russia. But we're going to come back and solve these problems in just a moment. Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guests. We'd invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. If you're involved with a PBS or community access television station, or perhaps an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you have a podcast, or you just have a computer and you like our shows and you'd like to share them, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today, we're taking a look at an institution that touches all of our lives every day. So often we don't even know about it, but it does, and that is the United Nations. My guest today is an expert on the UN, and Dr. Jean Krasno just wrote a book recently titled United Nations Policy and Practice. Jean, we're talking about the United Nations, and there's so much we could talk about, and no matter what we say now about the horrific invasion and carnage that took place October 7th and 8th and 9th, really, in Israel, will totally be out of date. It'll just, the situation is changing so quickly. But as you look at the United Nations system, what I know that there are parts of the UN system that have been working really since the UN created Israel and Palestine back in 1947 to try to broker peace and to set up a two-state situation, which was the intention back then and still is for a large number of people who are involved in this whole discussion. But what are some of the mechanisms and the institutions at the UN that can help deal with this problem?
Well, this problem has a long history and is extremely complex. Yes, as you correctly say, the UN was tasked to come up with a solution back in 1948, 49. And they set up a commission to look at it and came up with a partition plan, which would have divided the Palestinian territory at that time into two equal parts. And it was rather complex, what they had planned, but ultimately it failed, even though the Secretary General at the time tried to get UN peacekeepers capable of use of force to be able to actually enforce the partition plan. But member states were not interested in doing that. And so it fell into conflict. The state of Israel was created, and it expanded its territory. So, and through various other wars, the boundaries have changed over time. So, from what I have read over the last couple of days, the Security Council has been holding what they call consultations. And the term consultation in that sense means that they are meeting privately to discuss this issue, but it is not open to the public. It is not open to other member states, only the 15 council members, to be able to have a lot of private conversations to go over what the UN can do about this. But it's horrific. It's horrific, but it's been festering and festering. And so a solution is not easy to come up with. There's been talk about a two-state solution, but when you look at a two-state solution now, the Palestinians get much less land than if they had accepted the partition plan to begin with, which is something that I teach. I show maps, and and it's extremely frustrating. And I don't know how Israel can stay a Jewish state, which it wants, and also be really a democracy. And I think we all have to, be aware of that. And there has to be outside leverage to help solve this situation, because
it's extremely difficult, and it's even thornier now than it was a month ago or 2 months ago, and it's going to harden both sides, and who probably go in different directions. Well, as you have viewed the 78th General Assembly, are there any other issues that have come up just very briefly that we should mention? There's so many that they discuss, especially climate change and Ukraine, always on the front burners. And now Israel's on the front burner. But are there any others in a minute or two or three that you want to mention?
Well, I'm glad that you brought up climate change, because, as these crises emerge, we tend to forget about the global crisis of climate change, which we are all witnessing. We always thought that it was years off, but it's here today, with extreme weather and fires and flooding and drought and the crazy things that we're coping with now. But the UN has done a very good job of focusing the international community on the problem of climate change. I mean, what if the UN weren't looking at it? What if we didn't have the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that every year produces the data that we need. They bring scientists together to give us the data so we know what's actually happening. And we have the Conference of Parties now that are meeting every year. And the last one that we've had was what they call COP27, in which the industrialized countries acknowledged that they have to do more in terms of financing the loss that has happened in the developing world, and help the developing world mitigate the effects of climate change, as you know, and in the long term, help develop sustainable energy so we can pull back on the production of fossil fuels. These are national statements, but we have to hold every country accountable for this. And so we need the UN to keep a focus on this.
And you're absolutely right. If it hadn't been for the United Nations, we wouldn't be at this level of discussion of climate change at all, because the UN started this back in the 70s, really. You come right down to the first environmental conference in 1972, and has built upon it and has provided the expertise and the best information available at that time to the leaders of the world to help them deal with this problem. But this past week, we saw where Secretary General Guterres, apparently his patience is running pretty low and pretty thin with the leaders of the world. He was actually calling them failures, come right down to it, even though a lot has been done by some countries. And even in the United States, the last 2 years, we've had remarkable movement in dealing with trying to move to clean energy and that type of thing. But they're not doing enough quickly enough. And this is the challenge. And the UN, as I think you mentioned earlier, is not a one world government. It can't make these countries do it. In order to be successful, these countries have to take the lead and do it. And that makes the UN program successful. But the UN's almost like the structure within which all the participants come together, and they have to carry it out, is it not?
Yes, absolutely. And I teach international law. And one of the things that I teach in that class is that you have to have this structure, but you have to develop the norms. People have to believe in following up, that the goal of combating global warming, it has to be something that people believe is true, and that everybody has to do something about it. So that normative aspect, the behavioral aspect of it, is just as important as having the conventions and the structures. So without, that normative aspect. So the UN also works very hard to get that message out. And I would like the media to play a bigger role in that as well.
They have a major role, as well as the educational institutions, and the media do not do the job. I'm part of this crowd. Trust me, they get very upset when I say that, but most of the media do not try to focus as much on the UN and how it impacts our lives. But one thing I did want to, we're just about out of time, but I want to mention that you have been involved in dealing with the papers of former Secretaries General Kofi Annan and Ban Ki-moon, the 7th and 8th Secretaries General. And our viewers can go to the website www.reiner.com to take a look at that. But what we've been talking about today is so important, and the UN does impact our lives. And as has been said so many times, UN's indispensable. If we didn't have it today, we'd have to recreate it tomorrow. Somebody's got to help move aircraft, ships, mail, weather information around the world. Somebody has to try to bring peace to very violent areas of the world, try to help refugees, try to work with Rotary International to eliminate polio and just on across the board. But these are all services and programs that we hear very little about. But Dr. Jean Krasno, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Well, thank you, Bill. It's wonderful to talk to you. I appreciate it. Thanks.
Okay, my pleasure. Thank you. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.